The last part of the diencephalon is the epithalamus. And the epithalamus contains the pineal gland. It was thought when it was discovered that it kind of looked like a pineapple. And it secretes melatonin, which is for sleep regulation. So this is the same melatonin that you actually can go to the store and get. It's a hormone naturally released, and it kind of tells your body, hey, it's time to start to wind down, to start to get to bed. So we see our epithalamus here, the rest of the diencephalon with the thalamus, as well as the hypothalamus. And also within this area is a choroid plexus. So there's essentially two choroid plexuses. The choroid plexus is what has actually the ependymal cells. It's not within the ventricle, but it's within the choroid plexus. Remember, they secrete the CSF, and that travels all around the central nervous system. There's also another choroid plexus, which we'll see later, which is located just between the cerebellum and also the pons here. Our next slide is on the brainstem, so we're progressively starting to move in an inferior direction, and you're kind of seeing a trend here. So the more superior the location, the more advanced it is. So the cerebrum, cerebral cortex, is the executive function. Once we move down, we have more primal or necessary functions, like in the diencephalon. Then we move to the brainstem, which is automatic reflexes, things that help to keep you alive. So in the brainstem here, we're going to look first at the medulla. And so remember, we saw the diencephalon already with the thalamus and the hypothalamus. We saw the pituitary gland. This is just looking at a lateral view of the thalamus. And then below that, as we continue down, you can see some of the cranial nerves, which you won't have to know until chapter 13. But it's interesting to note that the large majority of them come from the brainstem. So the brainstem is made up of the midbrain, the pons, and then the medulla. The medulla is just going to be directly superior to the spinal cord, where the decussation of pyramids happens. And remember, the word decussation just means crossover. So those projection fibers that are coming from the cortex are crossing over to the other side. So let's look at the bullets first, and then we'll look more at the diagram. One thing I want to point out is what's called the corpora quadrigemina, and again, that's in the midbrain. The corpora quadrigemina, quad indicates that there are 4 bumps, and the top 2 bumps are the superior colliculi. And they're responsible for a visual reflex to be able to track a moving object, and also for the pupillary reflex. So if a physician shines a light in your eye and your pupils don't respond, there might be something that's going on with your midbrain. The ability to track a moving train, for example, that would be the job of superior colliculus. Then the inferior colliculus is the auditory reflex. Let me add a Y there. It's the auditory reflex and also the startle reflex. So if you suddenly got startled, that would be your inferior colliculus. So the brainstem, it's like the spinal cord because it's just above it, but it contains these embedded basal nuclei. And since it's at the very bottom, it controls automatic behaviors necessary for survival. And it has pathway for tracks between higher and lower brain centers. These are those projection fibers. And it contains 10 of the 12 pairs of cranial nerves. So what that means is there's only 2 cranial nerves in the forebrain. And those are going to be cranial nerves 1 and cranial nerves 2. So this is kind of a way to summarize the different parts. The diencephalon shows thalamus, hypothalamus. We just don't have the epithalamus, so I'm going to go ahead and add that. And then for the brainstem, we have the midbrain, pons, and the medulla oblongata. So moving down, looking at the lateral view, first of all, we can see the bumps in the back. So collectively, there are 4 bumps. The top 2 bumps are the superior colliculus, and that's the visual reflex. And the inferior reflex is the auditory or the startle reflex. You don't have to know where the various cranial nerves are now. You'll be learning that in your next chapter. But you can see the majority of them are listed. So you may want to use this diagram to go back to and help you with lab as well. So our next slide is the inferior view of the brain, showing the brainstem, which, as you should know by now, is the midbrain, pons, and the medulla oblongata. So we can see the frontal lobe here, and this is thought of as the forebrain. It's going to be the location of cranial nerve 1 and 2. And I know this is in chapter 13, but cranial nerve 1 is the olfactory nerve. So it begins at the top of the nose. And cranial nerve 2 is the optic nerve, which begins at the back of the retina. So it shows the frontal lobe, the olfactory bulb, which is the synapse point of the olfactory nerve. So it kind of begins at this point right here and continues back. The optic chiasm is the point where it crosses over. Then it becomes the optic nerve, which is cranial nerve 2. The optic tract continues back to mammillary bodies. You can see the optic nerve is right here, and this is the tract. It's called the tract because, as you'll learn in chapter 15, it includes information from the retina from the opposite side. So we have the mammillary body, the midbrain pons, which would be part of the medulla, the temporal lobe, that's for auditory, medulla, cerebellum, and spinal cord.